Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing another new movement in not just literature, but in a multi-genre form. And this is something referred to as modernism. Okay, this is something that occurs in the aftermath of the First World War and is really kind of a visceral response to the death and devastation and destruction caused by the war. Okay, there's a period in time where the world really does not know what to do with itself. Okay, it has to essentially reinvent society in various ways. And the outlook for the future is not exactly bright. Okay, a lot of people realize that this type of war is something that could potentially happen again in the future. And so people start to look at things with a bit more of a pessimistic attitude and to, in some ways, just appreciate what is versus what could be. Okay, and so that's kind of where the birth of the modernist movement comes from. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about it here. Now again, this is a philosophical and artistic movement, okay? And so when we call it that, the typical reference to the term modernism typically goes along with art and literature in most people's minds, okay? But it actually begins as a philosophical movement first before it turns into one. And again, this occurs specifically after the First World War, okay? So it begins sometime around 1918, okay? World War I ends in 1917 toward the end of the year, and then starts to kind of pick up in the modernist movement thereafter. And again, not just in art and literature and philosophy, but it also starts to affect sociology, psychology, and really begins to change the map for the way that people view the world at this period in time. Okay? And the biggest desire in the midst of all this is to break away from tradition and to shock the world in some way. Okay, and so this is it's a traumatic response is the best way I can really put it. It's trying to reenact the shock that occurs with the First World War in a certain way, but not exactly in a way to depict death and destruction all over again. We're not necessarily talking about that, but we're trying to break away from traditional modes of thought, traditional modes of experiencing the world through art, through literature, and that sort of thing. Okay, so a lot of the religious traditions of the time period, a lot of the conservative movements of the time period start to get pushed aside by modernism, and they become at odds with one another. And again, this is a much more cynical worldview than what has gone before. Okay? And it's based on three major suppositions, each of which is fairly shocking in and of itself. Okay? The first supposition here is the one that is kind of the big gut punch for a lot of people, and the supposition is that there is no God. Okay? Up until this point, the major heads of state, the major heads of countries all over the world, in many ways were essentially the heads of their local churches. Okay? You have the Queen of England, who is or in this case the king at this period in time, was the head of the Church of England. The head of the German church, the Russian Orthodox Church was the Tsar. Again, so you got all these different countries in the world that are headed by traditional values more so than anything. And that, coupled with imperialism, which we talk a little bit about in the history class, seems to breed the idea that the traditional methods of ruling the world or ruling one's country or society and so forth tend to have very negative ramifications, as we see in the First World War. Okay? Imperialism and the response to it is really the big trigger mechanism for the whole war in the first place. Okay? And so all of the tradition behind all this leads up to kind of this religious core of things, and the idea that there is such a thing as a merciful God is something that's very difficult for people to swallow, especially after all the horrors of the First World War. Okay, people begin to look at death and being a soldier and so forth as something that's not really glorious, right? There's nothing romantic about dying face down in the mud, suffocating from mustard gas, or being shot to death, or any of those things. Okay, the romanticism is completely stripped out of the idea of conflict, and so the idea here at the core of the modernist movement really is the idea that, well, all these things happen not necessarily because God allows it or because humans are really so horrible or whatever, but because there is no God. Okay, and that it's the simplest explanation for many people. Okay, there is no God, and therefore humanity really does what it will to each other. Okay? Again, not the most bright and breezy of of ideas at the start of all this, but it simplifies everything else moving forward. The second thing, which is a little bit more metaphysical, is the idea that reality, quote unquote, is not anything that is rational. Okay, so in other words, this is where we get into a little bit more of the philosophy here. Ideally, if there is a God, then everything makes sense. Okay, that's kind of the pre-modern idea here. But if there is no God, then nothing really makes sense. Okay, nothing is rational, nothing is orderly, and nothing is really obvious either. Okay, in other words, we as human beings invent our own reality, okay? For better or for worse. And the third thing here, and the kind of the stuff that gets built on top of this foundation, is that social progress is not something that needs to be taken for granted, right? Just because we have envisioned a bright future in the past, it doesn't mean that it's really going to come to fruition unless we really make it that way. Okay, everybody has to pitch in order for this to become a reality. If the world is going to get into another major conflict with itself, with one nation versus another one, then there's no real guarantee that social progress is going to actually occur at all. Okay? So it's basically dropping humans into a world where everything is pitting itself against them, okay? And humans kind of have to dig their way out of it. Okay? Now, when it comes to the philosophical aspect of modernism, this goes along with a lot of the socio-political movements that come about during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, the idea of Darwinism in particular couples very comfortably, I guess, with modernism because it challenges traditional organized religion. Okay, Darwinism says that the Bible should not be taken literally, that individuals like Adam and Eve were not actual beings, right? That it's more of a metaphor than anything else, and that humans actually evolved from a lower primate species into what we are today. The next thing that goes along with this is the political aspect, and this is when we start to see that in the United States in particular, different political movements aside from capitalism are being entertained. Okay? Capitalism is looked at as being a catalyst for a lot of corruption, okay? Specifically when it comes to the Republican Party during the 19th century, right? We see big business starting to take serious advantage of its workers. People are getting injured, they're dying right and left, and the plight of workers is something that comes to the forefront in a very major way. And workers tend to flock toward the ideas of Marxism, okay, set down by Karl Marx, the father of communism. Okay? And Marxist ideals say that one day the working class, what he refers to as the proletariat, is going to rise up and overthrow those who own the means of production, so what he calls the bourgeoisie. Okay? So this is something that he expects to happen at some point in time, okay? And it's something that sounds very appealing if you're a factory worker living in the United States, okay? Because, again, the people who own the means of production are very, very corrupt, right? In some cases, they're brutal. They don't care about their workers. They work them to death. And if you were a worker, you were considered almost expendable, okay? So if you want to have rights for yourself, for your family, for your coworkers, whatever it happens to be, then you have to fight for them. Okay? And the idea of Darwinism, right, that the stronger will end up surviving here, again, couples a little bit more with the idea of Marxism. Okay? So if you want to fight against the people who have power, you have to become powerful yourself. And in again, another metaphysical sense, we can talk about what is called existentialism. Okay? This is something where we look at existence itself. What purpose do we have for existing if there is the supposition that there is no God, there is no order to the universe? Why are we here? Okay, what is our purpose? What are we supposed to be doing? What should we do going forward? So all these things are things that start to really, really plague humanity, and specifically people in the United States during this period in time. Okay, again, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the more pessimistic view in the outcome of existentialism is something that is called nihilism or nihilism, depending on how you pronounce it. Nihilism says that life has no meaningful objective, okay? That you're really here just to chase base pleasures, right? Drink, eat, be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's kind of the whole view of nihilism. And not necessarily an evil or a negative idea, right? It's something that would seem to be worldly and evil to someone who is perhaps from a traditional religious background, right? All these things are supposed to be embodiments of Satan or embodiments of temptation, that sort of thing, something that you're supposed to strive to get away from if you're part of organized religion. Now, when it comes to literature itself, several new features are presented in literature on behalf of modernism. One is known as the unreliable narrator or narrators. Now, in most stories in the 19th century going backward, anytime there is a narrator of a story, it's typically an individual who can be relied upon to tell the truth. Okay? Whether it is supposed to be a figure who is detached from everything, or a figure who is actually taking part in the story itself, there's someone who can be relied upon to be factual and give genuine information to the reader, right? People take them for granted. But when it comes to modernism, you start to have stories that are told from a first-person perspective, right? You have a person narrating their own experiences. And the narrator might not be someone who is all there. Okay? What I mean by that is you might have a narrator who is a liar. You might have a narrator who is a sociopath or a psychopath. Okay? You might have someone who is schizophrenic or suffers from some mental disability that prevents them from telling what is objective truth. And so the story itself becomes something more subjective. Okay, it's open to more interpretation. Okay, people can look at this and say, well, this person says this one thing in this way, but a few pages later they contradict themselves. Okay, so just like everything else within modernism, there is no objective truth. Okay, there's nothing that is that makes sense or that is ordered. Okay, we have to invent it ourselves. Okay? Makes it more open to interpretation. Can make it more frustrating though for people who expect their narrators to be reliable. One of the most famous instances of this is the book Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Okay, this is a book about a young man who his mind is he's slowly losing his mind, okay, over the course of the story, and we don't really know when he's detaching from reality and when he's not, okay, whether he's telling the truth or lying to us. Okay, so it's a very difficult story to get through just for that, if nothing else. Stream of consciousness is another thing that goes along with this as well. You don't necessarily have a scripted, organized way of telling a story. Sometimes you just have someone who is a narrator who comes on and just says whatever is on their mind. Okay? Again, the narrator from Catcher in the Rye does this as well. Okay? He goes off on tangents, starts talking about other things, and suddenly you're completely off topic, you're confused as the reader, and the author means for that to happen. Internal monologue is another thing that never really gets explored and becomes a very effective tool that still is used in all styles of writing today. A common example of this, I've said before that I'm a comic book fan, but if you ever read a comic book of some kind, you have actual dialogue bubbles between characters, but in order to get inside of a character's head, sometimes you'll have a thought bubble that will pop up instead, right? It looks more like a little fluffy cloud than anything else. And in some cases, there are characters who act and speak almost exclusively in thought bubbles. Okay, they may never utter a word out loud, but everything is going on inside their heads. Okay? And so this becomes a very effective way of doing that in stories. In actual literature, you see writers like Stephen King use this all the time. When you have a character in the middle of a crisis, they're trying to figure things out. they go through an internal monologue, trying to orchestrate events and that kind of thing. Multiple points of view, of course, is another thing, especially if you have several storylines going on at the same time. Okay, this gets used quite often in a lot of ways. One very contemporary way that I can think of is the Game of Thrones books. You have storylines and chapters that are told from certain characters' perspectives. Okay? They may overlap with one another at some point. They may even contradict one another in some ways, but you're given a specific viewpoint of one particular character. Okay? So you never really know what's going on outside their head and outside their own view of things. Okay? They just experience the world, and you experience the world through them. Okay? So if you have multiple storylines, or if you have a plot and a subplot, okay, this gets used sometimes in television shows where you cut from one character's storyline to another character's. The lack of boundaries between poetry and prose is another thing. The difference between the two, the terms, of course, poetry, of course, is something that is told in verse, right? Like you would see in a poem or a song, right? It's told line by line in a lyrical way, okay? And prose is another term for something that is told in paragraph form, like you would see in a book or a short story, okay? And modernism sometimes will break away from one style or another. You might start a story, for example, that begins in prose form. It seems like a straightforward story. And then suddenly it might break away into rhyming couplets, or words might be spaced apart in a certain way, or you might have one word per line that goes down for several pages. Again, it can get distracting, it can get a little bit confusing, but it's meant to be that way. And shifts in literary structure is another thing. Again, this is something that can be confusing as well, but sometimes it's called fragmentary literature, where you have certain excerpts that are shown to a reader that seem incomplete. Okay, or again, kind of like stream of consciousness, you might have someone rambling on for a page or two, and then it stops abruptly, okay, and doesn't ever pick back up again. Kind of meant to show in some cases how a person's mind might be falling apart, okay, if they're suffering a mental breakdown, that sort of thing. Again, it's meant to be a literary tool. It's not perfect by any sense of the imagination, but it's effective in what it does. And there are subgenres of modernism as well. Okay, one that we know is called absurdism. Okay, this is pioneered in particular by the author Franz Kafka. And absurdism is where you have an instance that occurs in the midst of everything else that seems ridiculously absurd, like it would never actually happen, but everyone around a specific character seems to just kind of accept it for what it is. The most famous example of this from Kafka's works is a story called The Metamorphosis, and it involves a young man who is a salesman who wakes up one day to realize that he has been turned into a giant cockroach overnight. Okay? And it, again, seems very, very absurd. Obviously, this would never happen in the real world. But the rest of the story seems to follow a strangely logical conclusion. Okay? Just spoiler alert if you want to read the story or haven't. It ends with his family, who he has been providing for almost solely, right? Two parents and a younger sister, essentially giving up on him. Okay, they work as caregivers for him for a while, and they ultimately abandon him and let him starve to death. Okay, because he can't provide for them anymore. And again, it's pretty tragic, and it seems like a commentary on what society views a caregiver or a breadwinner to be like in this particular world. Once they lose their ability to provide for their family, they're essentially worthless. Okay, and that seems to be what Kafka is trying to emit or to emote to the audience. Another example of this is very, very similar to absurdism, is something that is exercised more and more often in the 20th century, and it's known as magic realism. Okay, and magic realism and absurdism, again, very, very similar to one another. Magic realism is when people are going through their everyday, mundane lives, and something spectacular happens, okay? Not unlike turning into a giant cockroach, right? You might have a fairy suddenly appear out of thin air, or a person might change into a monster or something like that. And people treat it in the story as if it's no big deal. Okay, they treat it as if this is something to be expected. We're not scared by it. We're not surprised by it. Really, it just happens that way. Okay, so the best example that an instructor in the past has told me about this is that magic realism is when something spectacular is made very boring. Okay, or conversely, sometimes something very boring is made very spectacular. Okay, and in that second way, you could think of it as something like characters in a fantasy world suddenly having to pay their taxes, right, or pay a bill or something like that. Seems out of place, seems ridiculous, but it's used as a tool to kind of again shock people out of complacency. And the example I typically associate with magic realism is the author Salman Rushdie. Okay, he is a very famous and controversial author, to say the least, for some works that he did in the late 80s. One in particular that was called the Satanic Verses. This actually got him in very big trouble with the Islamic world, specifically with the Ayatollah of Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who we'll talk about in future history chapters. Basically, the whole idea of Rushdie's story surrounds a particular episode in the history of Islam that again has been the subject of debate and controversy for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's a situation in which the Prophet Muhammad may have been, and again I stress may have been, not that I put any any validity to what he's doing. This is a work of fiction. Let me make that perfectly clear. But the entire story revolves around an instance where the Prophet Muhammad may have accidentally been taking dictation from the devil rather than from God or Allah. Okay, and again, this is the objective narration. I'm not saying one way or the other about any of this. But Salman Rushdie takes that idea and puts it into a contemporary storyline where characters are basically reliving this episode in the modern world. Okay, and one in particular, one character ends up growing a set of horns. He starts eating pork, which is totally against the tenets of Islam. He basically becomes a devil-like being because he's corrupted into it. And another being, another character, I believe, becomes something like an angel, grows wings, and is able to, fly and all this kind of thing. And the story got such a negative response from the Islamic world and the Ayatollah in particular. The Ayatollah actually put something out called a fatwa on Salman Rushdie's head. A fatwa is basically a death warrant, where he basically offered money in his own name for someone to actually hunt down and assassinate Salman Rushdie for blasphemy. Okay, if you ever read the story, it seems very innocuous, right? It references certain things within Islam, but from my own viewpoint, and I'm not Muslim, but from my own viewpoint, it doesn't seem to be as out there as it's been depicted as being. But the ideas of magic realism, though, again, they come out in this form, right? These characters are turning into angels and demons, and the rest of the world doesn't seem to pay them much mind. It doesn't pay them a whole lot of attention, right? This would be a spectacular thing in the real world, but in this particular case, people are like, oh, he's turning into a devil, okay, just no big deal. Another example of the latter here, of turning into a devil, would be something perhaps like the film Horns that has Daniel Radcliffe in it. This came out a few years ago, about a young man who, spoilers, is accused of murdering his girlfriend, and he has no memory of whether or not he actually did. And over the course of the story, he begins to grow a set of horns out of his forehead. Okay, and people begin to act really horribly around him. He's able to elicit negative emotions. He turns into a devil, essentially. Okay? And people don't really pay him much mind that he's growing horns or anything like that. So again, this is another example of something where it's meant to shock the reader, right? because we have a very traditional sensibility for the most part about the world around us. We're taught certain things, we're made to look at the world in a certain way, and modernism is meant to just kind of jar us out of that. So the last thing we can talk about here is modernism's effect in the artistic world. Okay, when it comes to painting and sculpture and so forth, modernism becomes something that ends up completely changing the face of what art actually means to society. For one thing, it directly challenges the idea of traditional art. Okay, we have a very specific idea in mind, many of us, what fine art happens to be, quote unquote, fine art. Okay, is it something that's representative? Is it something that has an element of beauty to it, certain lines and shapes and colors and so forth? Modern art is meant to violate that in some ways. In some ways, very offensively. Okay. Art is typically no longer realistic or representative for one thing. So if you have something that is meant to depict a person or a place, thing, a landscape of some kind, in most people's minds it looks nothing like what they would expect it to look like. Okay? The shapes are distorted. It might be very blocky. It might be grotesque even in some ways. That's another thing that gets brought into this. The works of Pablo Picasso, for example, were considered to be almost obscene because you have individuals with their faces shoved to one side of their head, right? The proportions are all wrong, the shapes are all wrong. And gradually art becomes more and more abstract, right? You have art that initially begins with a depiction of individuals or landscapes or something like that, and eventually over time artists begin to look at depicting emotions or something that has no corporeal form, right? They'll do a painting called Anxiety, and it'll just be random colors thrown on there, or certain shapes, or something that they perceive to represent anxiety. Okay, so it's much more open to interpretation, just like everything else in modernism. And there are subgenres to modernism in art as well. Surrealism is one of the most common versions of this. This is something that has a dreamlike quality to it, or perhaps even a nightmare quality. The work of Salvador Dali is very famous for this, as you see here. Dali was famous for painting the melting clocks. And Dali himself was actually a very surreal individual. He dressed very outlandishly, grew a long mustache, and actually waxed the tips of it to where it pointed straight up over his eyebrows. Okay. And Dali's works end up influencing a lot of other artists over time, including individuals like H.R. Giger. Giger actually was the man responsible for designing the alien creature in the film Alien. Another example of this is a Polish artist named Zdzisław Beksinski. Okay, he's a very difficult name to pronounce, but a lot of his paintings are kind of these hellish landscapes that seem to evoke nightmares of what people have experienced and so forth. Cubism, of course, as I said before, is directly related to Pablo Picasso. People are very accustomed to seeing this now, right? They can determine certain shapes. Right here you have a woman playing a guitar or a lute of some kind. And Cubism, of course, is taking cube shapes and actually trying to piece them together almost in this pixelated way to make an image. And then there's others like Impressionism, which you see here with Edvard Munch. The famous painting, The Scream, is one that goes along with this. And Impressionism, again, is something that you get the impression of a sunset, the impression of a boardwalk here. It's something that is painted with very broad strokes. So other examples of this include individuals like Vincent van Gogh, right, the man who cuts off his ear at one point in a fit of depression. So Van Gogh's Starry Night is a very famous one. Cafe at Midnight is another famous one. Of course, if you have Monet, right, Monet paints a lot of water lilies going along with the same type of thing, right, where you have impressions of moving water. So modernism, again, starts to really get its fingers into a lot of different things in the midst of all this. It's a movement that doesn't sit well with a lot of people at first. And of course now looking back, it's something that is very widely celebrated as being a new way of expression in art, and of course in literature, as I said before. So head on over now to your quiz section and go ahead and take the quiz on modernism. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone, and I'll see you later.